certificate is used to guarantee trust between two parties during a transaction. For example, when a user tries to access a web server, TLS certificates ensure that the communication between the user and the server is encrypted and the server is who it says it is. Let's take a look at a scenario. Without secure connectivity, if a user were to access his online banking application, the credentials he types in would be sent in a plain text format. A hacker sniffing network traffic could easily retrieve the credentials and use it to hack into the user's bank account. Well, that's obviously not safe, so you must encrypt the data being transferred using encryption keys. The data is encrypted using a key, which is basically a set of random numbers and alphabets. You add the random number to your data and you encrypt it into a format that cannot be recognized. The data is then sent to the server. The hacker sniffing the network gets the data but can't do anything with it. However, the same is the case with the server receiving the data. It cannot decrypt the data without the key. So a copy of the key must also be sent to the server so that the server can decrypt and read the message. Since the key is also sent over the same network, the attacker can sniff that as well and decrypt the data with it. This is known as symmetric encryption. It is a secure way of encryption, but since it uses the same key to encrypt and decrypt the data, and since the key has to be exchanged between the sender and the receiver, there is a risk of a hacker gaining access to the key and decrypting the data. And that's where asymmetric encryption comes in. Instead of using a single key to encrypt and decrypt data, asymmetric encryption uses a pair of keys, a private key and a public key. Well, they are private and public keys, but for the sake of this example, we will call it a private key and a public lock. We will get back to that at the end, but for now, think of it as a key and a lock pair. A key, which is only with me, so it's private. A lock that anyone can access, so it's public. The trick here is if you encrypt or lock the data with your lock, you can only open it with the associated key. So your key must always be secure with you and not be shared with anyone else. It's private. But the lock is public and may be shared with others. But they can only lock something with it. No matter what is locked using the public lock, it can only be unlocked by your private key. Before we go back to our web server example, let's look at an even simpler use case of securing SSH access to servers using key pairs. You have a server in your environment that you need access to. You don't want to use passwords as they're too risky. So you decide to use key pairs. You generate a public and private key pair. You can do this by running the SSH keygen command. It creates two files. id_rsa is the private key and id_rsa.pub is the public key. Well, not a public key, a public lock. You then secure your server by locking down all access to it, except through a door that is locked using your public lock. It's usually done by adding an entry with your public key into the server's SSH authorized_keys file. So you see, the lock is public and anyone can attempt to break through. But as long as no one gets their hands on your private key, which is safe with you on your laptop, no one can gain access to the server. When you try to SSH, you specify the location of your private key in your SSH command. What if you have other servers in your environment? How do you secure more than one server with your key pair? Well, you can create copies of your public lock and place them on as many servers as you want. You can use the same private key to SSH into all of your servers securely. What if other users need access to your servers? Well, they can do the same thing. They can generate their own public and private key pairs. As the only person who has access to those servers, you can create an additional door for them and lock it with their public locks. copy their public logs to all the servers, and now other users can access the servers using their private keys. Let's go back to our web server example. You see, the problem we had earlier with symmetric encryption was that the key used to encrypt data had to be sent to the server over the network along with the encrypted data. And so there is a risk of the hacker getting the key to decrypt the data. What if we could somehow get the key to the server safely? Once the key is safely made available to the server and client can safely continue communication with each other using symmetric encryption. To securely transfer the symmetric key from the client to the server, we use asymmetric encryption. So we generate a public and private key pair on the server. We're going to refer to the public log as public key going forward, now that you have got the idea. The SSH keygen command was used earlier to create a pair of keys for SSH purposes. So the format is a bit different. Here we use the OpenSSL command to generate a private and public key pair. And that's how they look. When the user first accesses the web server using HTTPS, he gets the public key from the server. Since the hacker is sniffing all traffic, let us assume he too gets a copy of the public key. We'll see what he can do with it. The user, in fact the user's browser, then encrypts the symmetric key using the public key provided by the server. The symmetric key is now secure. The user then sends this to the server. The hacker also gets a copy. The server uses the private key to decrypt the message and retrieve the symmetric key from it. However, the hacker does not have the private key to decrypt and retrieve the symmetric key from the message it received. The hacker only has the public key with which he can only lock or encrypt a message and not decrypt the message. The symmetric key is now safely available only to the user and the server. They can now use the symmetric key to encrypt data and send to each other. The receiver can use the same symmetric key to decrypt data and retrieve information. The hacker is left with the encrypted messages and public keys with which he can't decrypt any data. With asymmetric encryption, we have successfully transferred the symmetric keys from the user to the server, and with symmetric encryption, we have secured all future communication between them. Perfect. The hacker now looks for new ways to hack into your account, and so he realizes that the only way he can get your credential is by getting you to type it into a form he presents. So he creates a website that looks exactly like your bank's website. The design is the same, the graphics are the same, the website is a replica of the actual bank's website. He hosts the website on his own server. He wants you to think it's secure too, so he generates his own set of public and private key pairs and configures them on his web server. And finally, he somehow manages to tweak your environment or your network to route your requests going to your bank's website to his servers. When you open up your browser and type the website address in, you see a very familiar page, the same login page of your bank that you're used to seeing. So you go ahead and type in the username and password. You make sure you typed in HTTPS in the URL to make sure the communication is secure and encrypted. Your browser receives a key, you send encrypted symmetric key, and then you send your credentials encrypted with the key, and the receiver decrypts the credentials with the same symmetric key. You've been communicating securely in an encrypted manner, but with the hacker's server. As soon as you send in your credentials, you see a dashboard that doesn't look very much like your bank's dashboard. What if you could look at the key you received from the server and say if it is a legitimate key from the real bank server? When the server sends the key, it does not send the key alone. It sends a certificate that has the key in it. If you take a closer look at the certificate, you will see that it is like an actual certificate, but in a digital format. It has information about who the certificate is issued to, the public key of that server, the location of that server, etc. On the right, you see the output of an actual certificate. Every certificate has a name on it, the person or subject to whom the certificate is issued to. That is very important as that is the field that helps you validate their identity. If this is for a web server, this must match what the user types in the URL on his browser. If the bank is known by any other names, and if they'd like their users to access their application with the other names as well, then all those names should be specified in this certificate under the Subject Alternative Names section. But you see, anyone can generate a certificate like this. You could generate one for yourself saying you're Google. And that's what the hacker did in this case. He generated a certificate saying he is your bank's website. So how do you look at a certificate and verify if it is legit? That is where the most important part of the certificate comes into play. Who signed and issued the certificate? If you generated a certificate, then you will have to sign it by yourself. That is known as a self-signed certificate. Anyone looking at the certificate you generated will immediately know that it is not a safe certificate because you have signed it. If you looked at the certificate you received from the hacker closely, you would have noticed that it was a fake certificate that was signed by the hacker himself. As a matter of fact, your browser does that for you. All of the web browsers are built in with a certificate validation mechanism wherein the browser checks the certificate received from the server and validates it to make sure it is legitimate. If it identifies it to be a fake certificate, then it actually warns you. So then how do you create a legitimate certificate for your web servers that the web browsers will trust? How do you get your certificates signed by someone with authority? That's where certificate authorities or CAs comes in. They're well-known organizations that can sign and validate your certificates for you. Some of the popular ones are Symantec, DigiCert, Komodo, GlobalSign, etc. The way this works is, you generate a certificate signing request or CSR using the key you generated earlier and the domain name of your website. You can do this again using the OpenSSL command. This generates a my-bank.csr file, which is the certificate signing request that should be sent to the CA for signing. It looks like this. The certificate authorities verify your details, and once it checks out, they sign the certificate and send it back to you. You now have a certificate signed by a CA that the browsers trust. If hacker tried to get his certificate signed the same way, he would fail during the validation phase, and his certificate would be rejected by the CA. So the website that he is hosting won't have a valid certificate. The CAs use different techniques to make sure that you're the actual owner of that domain. You now have a certificate signed by a CA that the browsers trust. But how do the browsers know that the CA itself was legitimate? For example, what if the certificate was signed by a fake CA? In this case, our certificate was signed by Symantec. How would the browser know Symantec is a valid CA and that the certificate was in fact signed by Symantec and not by someone who says they are Symantec? The CAs themselves have a set of public and private key pairs. The CAs use their private keys to sign the certificates. The public keys of all the CAs are built in to the browsers. The browser uses the public key of the CA to validate that the certificate was actually signed by the CA themselves. You can actually see them in the settings of your web browser under Certificates. They're under Trusted CAs tab. Now these are public CAs that help us ensure the public websites we visit, like our banks, emails, etc., are legitimate. However, they don't help you validate sites hosted privately, say within your organization. For example, for accessing your payroll or internal email applications. For that, you can host your own private CAs. Most of these companies listed here have a private offering of their services. A CA server that you can deploy internally within your company. You can then have the public key of your internal CA server installed on all your employees' browsers and establish secure connectivity within your organization. So let's summarize real quick. We have seen why you may want to encrypt messages being sent over a network. To encrypt messages, we use asymmetric encryption with a pair of public and private keys. An admin uses a pair of keys to secure SSH connectivity to the servers. The server uses a pair of keys to secure HTTPS traffic. But for this, the server first sends a certificate signing request to a CA. The CA uses its private key to sign the CSR. Remember, all users have a copy of the CA's public key. The signed certificate is then sent back to the server. The server configures the web application with the signed certificate. Whenever a user accesses the web application, the server first sends the certificate with its public key. The user, or rather the user's browser, reads the certificate and uses the CA's public key to validate and retrieve the server's public key. It then generates a symmetric key that it wishes to use going forward for all communication. The symmetric key is encrypted using the server's public key and sent back to the server. The server uses its private key to decrypt the message and retrieve the symmetric key. The symmetric key is used for communication going forward. So the administrator generates a key pair for securing SSH. The web server generates a key pair for securing the website with HTTPS. The certificate authority generates its own set of key pair to sign certificates. The end user, though, only generates a single symmetric key. Once he establishes trust with the website, he uses his username and password to authenticate to the web server. With the server's key pairs, the client was able to validate that the server is who they say they are. But the server does not for sure know if the client is who they say they are. It could be a hacker impersonating a user by somehow gaining access to his credentials. Not over the network for sure, as we have secured it already with TLS, maybe by some other means. Anyway, so what can the server do to validate that the client is who they say they are? For this, as part of the initial trust building exercise, the server can request a certificate from the client, and so the client must generate a pair of keys and a signed certificate from a valid CA. The client then sends this certificate to the server for it to verify that the client is who they say they are. Now you must be thinking, you have never generated a client certificate to access a website. Well, that's because TLS client certificates are not generally implemented on web servers. Even if they are, it's all implemented under the hoods, so a normal user don't have to generate and manage certificates manually. So that was the final piece about client certificates. This whole infrastructure, including the CA, the servers, the people, and the process of generating, distributing, and maintaining digital certificates is known as Public Key Infrastructure, or PKI. Finally, let me clear up something before you leave. I've been using the analogy of a key and lock for private and public keys. If I gave you the impression that only the lock or the public key can encrypt data, then please forgive me, as it's not true. These are in fact two related or paired keys. You can encrypt data with any one of them and only decrypt data with the other. You cannot encrypt data with one and decrypt with the same. So you must be careful what you encrypt your data with. If you encrypt your data with your private key, then remember, anyone with your public key, which could really be anyone out there, will be able to decrypt and read your message. Finally, a quick note on naming convention. Usually, certificates with public key are named CRT or PEM extension. So that's server.crt, server.pem for server certificates, or client.crt or client.pem for client certificates. And private keys are usually with extension .key or -key.pem. For example, server.key or server-key.pem. So just remember, private keys have the word key in them usually, either as an extension or in the name of the certificate. And one that doesn't have the word key in them is usually a public key or certificate. Well, that's it for this lecture. Thank you for watching.